Welcome to once again to one of our Wednesday calls. Here we go. There we go. My name is John Van Etten. I'm the Managing Director of Human Synergistics Office here in Germany, taking care of much of Eastern and Central Europe. So thank you for joining me today. We're going to have about an hour. I know I went over last week, so I'm determined to come in under time this week. And the topic this week is ideals. So basically referring to things like OCI ideal, how we use the measurement of things like ideal culture, what that's useful for, and more specifically hoping to talk about using ideal descriptions at other levels of our tools other than the culture level where it's probably best known. So the content for today is pretty much focused around people who are accredited. So if you're not accredited in our tools, welcome and thank you for taking part. Happy to follow up with you after the call if you have questions. I hope this makes sense. But for those of you who are accredited, hopefully this will make much more sense and give you some insights into how we recommend ideals be used in projects and again, what they're useful for. Purpose is really to briefly go over what this is and then really what the benefits of using ideals are. And then finally to get into, again, other levels of the ideals. So let me start off by giving you a bit of history around the OCI ideal, where that came from, and then we'll get into the other topics. So again, if you're familiar with our tools, talking about the organizational culture and climate level that I'm surrounded by here, you may be familiar with the fact that these three tools that are behind me, the OCI current, the OCI ideal, and OEI, were actually developed at separate stages in HS history. The first of the organizational level tools to be developed was the OCI current, which measures, let's see if I can do this, which measures current culture and outcomes. My hands disappear, but over there, that half. This was around 1983 when we were really focused on answering questions like, can you measure organizational culture and what kind of well-being and performance criteria does culture predict and influence? It was several years later that we developed the OCI ideal, and it's sort of an interesting story. Basically, the way this evolved was once Human Synergistics was able to measure organizational culture, the current state, and give our clients some good information about, what your culture is so that they can understand that, have a language around it, and also how it's affecting their performance. The next questions that we would tend to receive are things like, well, especially if this is a developmental tool, in what direction should we develop our culture? Should we encourage more of this blue stuff? Maybe we want more red. Maybe there should be more green. So this was actually a real challenge for HS. For a number of years, we simply thought that we could explain to clients that what you want to move toward is a more constructive blue organizational culture. And we would happily show them lots of research and all of the data that we have demonstrating truly that it is really only those blue constructive styles that positively influence the performance of your people and positively influence things like well-being, engagement, motivation, and so on. For those of you who are consultants, you probably won't be surprised that this is a very difficult kind of discussion to have. Most organizations, most leadership teams that we run into will tend to believe, and if you're accredited in our culture level tools, this is the cultural misattribution of success playing in. They will tend to believe that their organization is successful not despite defensive patterns, but in fact because of defensive patterns. And this oftentimes causes people within the organization to believe that defensive red or green behavior is something that should be valued and encouraged. Again, having good data to answer that clearly is very helpful, but it is sort of a trap. And we found it to be very difficult to simply encourage organizations to move toward more constructive blue cultures. Really, because when you look at it, these are developmental tools, and if individuals or organizations are going to change, they need to recognize a need to change in themselves. I'm not going to lose weight because my doctor tells me I should. I'm going to lose weight when I realize that I should. So other people telling you what you need to change is not a particularly effective way to change. At the end of the day, we need to take this on board. And when we talk about culture, that means the organization and its leaders need to recognize and take this on board. So to make that much easier, we simply created the OCI ideal. Now, if you've gone through accreditation, of course, you know the OCI ideal is the same survey as the OCI current. It's the same 120 items. They're even in the same order. The only real difference between the two inventories is the lead-in statement. In the current culture, pointing in the wrong place, current culture, we're asking what is currently expected of you as a member of this organization. In the ideal, we're asking what should be expected of you so that you can contribute and perform most effectively. Now, this gives 4 very strong strengths of the OCI ideal, which is true, by the way, of using ideals at other levels as well. So I'll try to get there. The first real strength is that this is a self-defined goal. The leadership team, or perhaps everyone in the organization, sits down and describes very clearly what should be going on in this organization. They get to answer the questions, they get to create that profile, and therefore it is tremendously credible to the leadership team or the organization. This is the culture that we want taking place in this business. And then typically secondarily, we're measuring the current culture to see to what extent we're walking the talk or living that ideal and those values. So it's tremendously credible. We describe this ideal, we want this culture going on, and you will have very little difficulty, in my experience, with the organization or its leadership team at a later point saying, well, we don't really buy into that, that's not really where we want to go, maybe we want something else. If they sit down and complete the OCI ideal, they have a very clear goal against which you can obviously compare the current. Okay, the second benefit of the OCI ideal is it is constructive. It will be constructive, at least significantly more constructive than their current operating culture. We've been using OCI ideal around the world for over 30 years, and we have not, and this is true, found an organization that's described their ideal culture as anything other than predominantly constructive. I think I've shown you, let me see if I can find this. A slide that I oftentimes show in accreditations, this one showing OCI ideals from many of our clients across industries around the world in various places. And you can see the point. Regardless of the industry, the size, the geographic location, organizations and people describe constructive blue behavior as being most effective and appropriate within their organizations. So that gives us a very clear message. You can sort of know in advance before you complete the ideal what it's going to look like. Of course, your client may not, but at least you know you're going to get that constructive, the pattern against which, again, we'll compare the current. Now, they don't always describe, you know, a perfectly blue profile, and they certainly don't need to. This is less about perfection and more about direction. Where are we now? Where generally do we say we should be? And where are the gaps? And as long as they have that ideal, they're going to find that the gaps are, you know, we have too strong of extensions in the red and green area, and the extensions in the blue area are not as strong as we say they should be. And that allows them to use their own self-described target as a foundation for their development. And this really tremendously helps with the buy-in and acceptance for a culture initiative. So it's self-defined and credible. Secondarily, it's going to be constructive. So you will have the right direction to move in. But at least they get to define that for themselves. The other two things that the ideal is helpful for is really because it is constructive, it is a profile that is describing higher levels of performance and well-being than the current profile is. So you'll be able to basically, when you score that OCI ideal, one of the things I always do is bring up the client's value statements and demonstrate to them that their values are consistent with that ideal culture that they described. The second thing I like to do is to go into the outcome sections of the OCI report, the current OCI report, and get into your correlation analyses between the current culture and outcomes, and demonstrate to them that it is only those blue styles in their culture that are positively correlated to the performance and well-being of their people that they're interested in. If you use custom supplemental outcomes, very, very helpful to see how our culture is influencing whatever engagement, and that it's really only the constructive styles that are doing that positively. So those are the four things. Again, self-defined and credible. It's going to be constructive. It's going to be describing a higher level of performance and well-being, so you can demonstrate to them that this is the right way to go. And the fourth was values, that this is going to be consistent with their value statement and give them a framework and a set of language to understand how we live those values in the business. And when you compare that to the current culture, really the extent to which we're living the values in the current business. Okay, so that's the benefit of OCI ideal. Now I'll try to talk about the only other place where we include ideals and then make some recommendations further. The only other place that we ask ideal questions is in leadership impact and management impact. Again, those are the most recent tools, so I think we've sort of learned from our history. It's very hard to tell leaders that you should have a constructive impact. It's much easier to ask them how they would like to influence their people, what kind of behavior you want to see from them, very much along the lines of an OCI ideal. What should be taking place? What do you want to see from the people that you lead? And then compare that to the current state of what is my current impact on those people, receiving feedback from respondents, and comparing those two things directly. Again, using the same items so you can get down to the item level. I said I really want people to think in unique, creative ways, but they're telling me I'm really not encouraging them to do that. Why not, and what can I do differently? So again, these ideals, when compared to the current, is a tremendously clear and useful way to build a development initiative based directly on those data points of what I want to see in my team and from my people versus what I'm currently encouraging or what's currently taking place. Okay. That's leadership impact, management impact, and OCI ideals. I'll stop here because those are the ones that exist. See if there are any questions about that. And then next step will be to get into ideals across other tools and levels. You'll find that not only in certain individuals, but you'll of course find that around the world. So, you know, if you go to the US versus China versus other places and ask what should be going on, you'll get different descriptions, of course, of defensive behavior being to some extent tolerated and even ideal. So from my side, the bottom line is I've never questioned a client's ideal profile. If they describe perfectionism at the 99th percentile, as far as I'm concerned, go for it. I haven't had that happen. What I would say to you is just wait until the OCI current comes up and compare those two. Because even if their ideal is quite defensive, I've never seen one that's more defensive than the current state, if you see my point. So, and a lot of times this is a first step for organizations. So, you know, the clients who really use our tools most effectively are doing so in a process cycle. So I really, you know, if the ideals are a little defensive and a little unexpected in the first iteration of addressing culture, I try not to get too concerned about it. It's going to be more constructive and less defensive than their current. So they're going to come to a point where even though we want some perfectionism, we've got far more of it going on than we said we should. So you'll find that the development is still going to be reducing defensive behavior and promoting constructive behavior. And if you can get the client to move in that direction, then one thing you might do, and this is something we usually don't talk about with ideals, but that's retesting. You know, you can come in a couple of years later and say, let's have another look at where we really want to go. I've had consultants do this and organizations as well. Now, there are two pieces of this. One is I usually recommend you don't remeasure ideals, and I'll come back to this point. Mainly in the first step, I think it's not so helpful to ask multiple areas of the business and keep those as separate profiles, but I'll come back to that. Usually what you'll find if you do an OCI project and development and then remeasure the ideal, ask the leadership team 2 years later to redefine where we're going, you'll get a constructive profile that will be even more constructive than the original ideal. And what you're actually noticing here is the leaders are starting to connect with constructive behavior. They're starting to understand what that is. They have a language now. They've been on a 12-month journey. And now they're starting to be clearer around what really does work here and what doesn't work here. And therefore, you start to get sort of cleaner, constructive ideals. In any case, I wouldn't be concerned with their initial ideal, even if it is fairly defensive. What they say should be going on in their business is for them to say. I don't work in their business. If they really think that works, then rate that, and then we can run some analysis later to see whether all that perfectionism you want is really helping people to get results effectively, or maybe that's something that the leadership team might need to question in themselves, which is something you can demonstrate to them. It's kind of fun. You know, you say you want perfectionism, but now that we've done OCI and we look at perfectionism, we find it's causing all these problems. Is that something that you really want in this business? And that can be a really good leadership development kind of topic. All right, so that hopefully covers ideals for OCI and leadership management impact. So then let's talk about them at the other levels. The good news is we don't have to add too much. All of the benefits that I have already talked about for OCI ideal are true at the other levels. And what I'm really specifically talking about here are GSI, so the group styles inventory, and things like LSI for the individual level. So let me give you a few examples. When I used to do accreditation in the US, we taught those accreditation sessions together with a coach who was extremely experienced in coaching people with LSI. And one of their best practices was, while they did the LSI online, as most of our clients do as well, when they received the report from Human Synergistics, and before they would go to the first coaching session, they would make sure to take along with them a paper copy of the LSI-1. And what they would use that for is asking the person in the very first session to sort of reflect on their situation. By the way, this is something we already do. If you are familiar with our workbooks and coaching guidelines, this is part of the first step that we should do. I have a discussion with the person with big questions around, you know, where are you in your career? What are your biggest challenges? What do you hope to achieve? So on and so forth. Then a very useful exercise is to have the focal participant, the person being coached, to think of themselves in the future. 2 years from now, you've, in kind of an ideal perspective, you've accomplished the things that you wanted to accomplish. You've overcome the challenges that are holding you back right now. You're sort of picturing yourself in the future as the ideal you that you want to develop toward. And once you kind of have that mental picture, then the focal participant is asked to sit down and literally describe that future version of yourself in the LSI paper inventory, the ideal you. Then they can tear that open and score it. And what you'll find if you do this is they describe a profile that's very similar to their actual current LSI-1 profile that's in the report, but it will be significantly more constructive, typically across all 4 styles, and significantly less defensive across all the red and green styles. It might not be a perfect blue profile, but it's going to be more constructive and less defensive than the current me profile that they completed in the LSI-1 originally, and serves as a fantastic comparison point for them. Especially once they start getting into the report, just as we do recommend, the first thing they'll get into is the self-description. And here we go. We have a picture of how I see myself versus how I would like to be. And that is incredibly powerful, just as it is at the organizational level in getting the individual to personally own this development. I'm not doing LSI just because my boss told me I have to, or all the leaders are doing it, but I have described how I want to be myself personally in 2 years. I have a picture of where I am right now, and I get to compare those two things, and I get to work toward the target that I defined for myself. Yes, that's going to be in line with what the business wants and what the initiative for all of us leaders is about, but making it personal to the individual so that I can connect my goals to this development initiative is really one of the best ways that we can help people to develop. And using an LSI ideal is very, very powerful way to do that. Okay, so that's LSI. GSI, very similar. So in this case, we can ask the team. And again, as a first step, we've begun talking to clients about this. So for example, we have a team who used to meet face-to-face every day. Now they're in home office and they're working remotely. And they find that they're having some challenges with things like communication, delegation, time management, understanding what the goal is, you name it. We can do a few things. If you're familiar with GSI, we can talk to them about how they behave currently as a remote team and start understanding how that affects their performance. But to be honest with you, again, the thing that they're going to connect with most easily is their own descriptions. So what I would recommend in those cases is to first take the team, if possible, through GSI from an ideal perspective. How does this team need to function? How do we need to work together in order to be collaborative, communicative, know what the goals are? How should this team work together? And have them go through the GSI first from that idealized perspective of what should be going on. I like this method for another reason, not only all the points I've made before, but starting with the ideal helps the client to start thinking about solution-oriented thinking rather than problem-oriented thinking. When we meet with clients and talk about culture, they typically talk about the problems. People aren't engaged, people aren't communicating, people aren't collaborative. When we talk about home office teams or teams, we hear what the problems are. It's a tremendously helpful first step to just start talking to the team or that organization about what should be going on. Let's put the problems aside for a moment and talk about the way we should work, how things should go, not what the problems are or who's to blame, but where do we want to go here? And describe that essentially in this case in the GSI ideal description. Once we have that, then of course, using GSI as it typically is intended to measure the current team dynamic, and then comparing that not only to their ideal, but looking at their outcomes really fills in all the blanks, much like it does for in OCI ideal. That profile is now, we don't have to convince you to move toward the blue styles. This is what the team said we need. This is where the team currently is. They've really defined the development for themselves. We say we should be more communicative and collaborative. We're not. You, the consultant, we human synergistics are not imposing this change on them. They're really recognizing it for themselves once we give them a model and a language to use. Okay, so that's LSI, really can be done also in LWS. GSI, very, very useful across the other levels. There are only a few sort of drawbacks to this that I can think of. The first is cost. So there is an additional, unfortunately, of course, an additional survey that's going to have to be answered to capture the ideal. Having said that, a lot of times you don't have to ask, much like OCI, you may not have to ask every individual. Maybe we can do a sample across teams, invite people to take part. Only maybe a handful will actually go through and fulfill. But in any case, getting some feedback around how teams should function in this organization, and then using that combined profile as a goal that all of the teams can use to work toward. But in any case, it is a time issue. It's also, a cost issue. It's also a time issue. If you're familiar with our surveys, GSI is quite short, but many of them, like OCI and so on, are pretty long. LSI as well. So having people answer it a second time, if you will, from an ideal perspective, is a bit of a cost and time investment. But in my experience, it pays off. It pays off really once you get the reports and you start deciding whether change is necessary And if so, what and how do we need to move forward? Without that ideal perspective, a lot of times clients really struggle to decide whether any development is needed, and if so, in what styles. By the way, you can also use ideals across levels. So for example, if you're working with a client who's used OCI, current and ideal, and now they're wanting to expand and start looking at how their teams function, then why not use the ideal from their OCI? And use that as the ideal that the teams should work toward. That is perfectly applicable, and I think is really the best, because you're using one ideal profile that the organization moves toward, whether that's in their culture initiatives, their team development, their leadership development. You know, that ideal is consistently referenced throughout their development. I've had many clients do this. So, and some of the largest ones using, you know, here's our OCI ideal. That's the comparison point, not just for OCI around the world, but that's what we want our LWS, our leaders' feedback should look like that. GSI should look like that. This is the profile we're looking for, and that's the ideal that we're going to compare all of these tools to. Again, it's one of the benefits to using HS models and that circumplex that is, you know, a consistent model of behavior across levels. So, you know, if we have the ideal, especially at the organizational level, why not use that as the target for all of the any other tools that are being used in the business? All right, timing wise, I think we're right about where I wanted to be. So good. Then I can quiet down and hopefully hear from you in terms of questions. Usually when we ask clients to describe for themselves what the culture is, they come up with something that's sort of less only blue, and they see it as realistic, because usually when I talk to clients before they do OCI ideal, and you don't want to influence them, but you're asking them to describe where this business is going, not something that's unrealistic for the business to move toward. You know, what should be going on here should not be an unrealistic thing. It should be still within the realm of reality. And that's what they're describing, what should be going on here, which is why I don't push back if they have some significant extensions in defensive styles, because they think that works here. And at least if we compare it to the current, again, they're going to move in the right direction. But I haven't had people refute their own ideal. I'll tell you one of the biggest examples of why OCI ideal is useful, and it's one of our biggest clients. And this is years ago. This was 8 years ago that I was asked to do this, but a classic example of why OCI ideal is useful. We started by using OCI through a consultant at the very senior level of the organization, and a very aggressive culture. We knew that kind of beforehand. And we tried to get the leadership team to complete both OCI current and OCI ideal. But they were far too busy and didn't have the time, and said, we only have time to answer one, so we're just going to do the current. So they answered the current survey, and this is a perfect example of why ideals are useful. Answered the current, and then they asked me to come down to their office to debrief the report to them, because no one was accredited. So I went down and spent about half a day going through the models and then showing them their report and their current profile, which was super red, and their level of stress and their burnout and all of their things, and it made a lot of sense to them. And then we started looking at through the report, and all of a sudden here's this ideal profile that you should move toward. And they said, well, what is this ideal? Because we didn't have a chance to answer the ideal, or we didn't. And if you know OCI, you know that if you don't do the ideal, you get the historic ideal included for you. So of course I explained where the historic comes from, and you know, it's these companies and it's an average, and you know, if you don't do your own, it's just it's a reference point. But they weren't having it. It was some of the most aggressive reaction I've ever had to the historic ideal. It's literally, the quote was, that is not our data. That is not our company. That is not our industry. It does not apply to us. You should not include it. I'm shocked you ever put that in our report. It does not belong. And I said, you know what? I agree with you. The only ideal that should be included is yours. You should be the ones to describe where your business is going. You're damn right we should. So great. Let's build an OCI ideal profile project. We built it in like an hour. They sat down and answered that description and described it for me. And the beautiful part was the last thing they said before we launched the project was, this historic ideal cannot be our ideal because it is far too blue and it's not red enough. We need a more aggressive profile. So they sat down and in 30 minutes, less than that, 15 minutes, they answered the ideal. We scored it and gave them the profile. And I'm going to share my screen because I want to try to show it to you. If you're familiar with the historic ideal, I'm trying to find one on here that looks like the historic because I don't think I have it right in front of me, I'm afraid. No, I don't. So if you're not familiar, the historic ideal might look something like this one that I'm circling right now. It's very constructive. It's a little more constructive than this, but it does have some oppositional and competitive, and it does have a little bit of green. So the client was telling me this profile is impossible because it's not red enough and it's far too blue. They came back and actually completed the survey, and I have their profile in here. You're going to love this. It's this one way over here that I'm circling right now. It's actually more blue than the historic ideal and less red and less green. You see the point? So, and that shows you the depth of the cultural misattribution of success. They were so convinced that it was red behavior that was getting them results that they just heard aggressive and said, that's what we need. If they sit down and answer the survey and actually answer which of these behaviors they want, they realize that, you know, the things that we thought were getting jobs done was aggressive. It's not. It's actually an achievement. And they described one of the cleanest, bluest ideal profiles I've ever seen. And it was perfect because they looked at it, they looked at their answers and they went, ah, damn it, you're right. That is what we need. And that was really the last time that that leadership team ever fought against the change, and it was probably the first real aha moment for that organization, and what led to them embarking on 8 or 9 years at this point of culture development, because they really realized that what we were sure was getting us results and we were sure needs to be going on is really not the case at all. And unless we really sit down and describe that in detail, we really get on the wrong track. It's a great example of how this can help clarify things. And then they never argued with that beautifully clean ideal again, where they would argue with and shoot down the historic ideal immediately. They can't do that when they describe it for themselves, and they come up with a profile that we can work with. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, cool. All right. Other questions about ideals or examples, experiences? It's a very, very good point. We don't usually run into that challenge too much, but we've run into something like this. So what I'm trying to, so I wasn't sure we'd get into this point, but you're bringing it up. What's really interesting is you get very constructive descriptions of what could be going on as long as people are referencing themselves. So this is sort of to your point. Hopefully this will add up when we get there. So what I mean by this is, you know, if you look at the OCI ideal, the lead-in, it's asking what behavior should be expected of you, what should be going on so that you can contribute and perform most effectively. It's talking about what you need personally to perform well. And we get nice blue descriptions. What's really interesting is sometimes the answer changes when we start talking about other people. And we've had clients do this before, and I'll give you an example. So I've had a leader come to me at another client organization and say, well, we don't want to talk about the ideal culture. What we want to describe is the ideal employee. And we'll have the leaders describe how the ideal employee behaves. And that will be the target for our culture development. It's really very interesting, but at the end of the day, what you find is, you get this in leadership and management impact a little bit as well, is if people are referencing themselves, you'll consistently get blue styles. As soon as people start thinking of someone else, you might get a different answer. If you do get a different answer, it tells you a lot about the person answering the questions. So I'll try to give you an example. If I answer OCI ideal, yes, I need to know what the goal is. I need to know what my role is and what I'm expected of me. And I need some autonomy, and I need some responsibility, and I need people who can help me if I need help, and so on, right? Constructive stuff. That I know is going to help me move forward. And everybody describes that because they're really referencing some basic human needs and motivations, which these models are built upon. But if you start asking me what my team needs to get the job done, my answer might change. My team, maybe, I'm a little suspicious that maybe they're not up to the challenge or not quite knowledgeable enough. So for them to do the job, it's not enough to know what the goal is and have autonomy and some responsibility and my help when they need it. No, maybe what they need is lots of supervision. Some micromanagement even, I need to check in on them and control them and make sure they're not getting off track. And now you start to get a pretty defensive description of what ideally should be taking place. It's a really interesting effect. You'll sometimes see it in leadership impact. So I've had a case where, you ask 10 leaders what the culture should be, and boom, you get a nice blue profile. Great. Then you start asking each leader what kind of behavior they want to encourage and promote in the people that they lead. And 9 out of the 10 leaders, it's all blue. And then one leader, not at all. It's very, for example, passive. And when you start talking to that leader, they'll say, yes, for me to function, I need the blue stuff. But for my people, I'm not sure that's good for them. They need more controls and rules and so on. It gets back to things like theory X, theory Y leadership. It gets to things like maintaining a positive opinion of yourself versus being able to maintain a positive opinion of other people. There's some other things going on there. But the point is that I try, when we use ideals, to have people reference themselves. What should go on in this organization culturally so that you can perform? How should this team function so that you can contribute most effectively? And LSI is a perfect example. Yourself in the future, what does that look like? What's going to help get you where you want to be? If you frame it based on the focal participant themselves, you'll get the constructive styles. It might change a little bit if you start asking people what they need from other people. I actually saved the ideal employee profile. I really advised the client against it, but they were dead set that they wanted to do it. So we did it with a small group of leaders describing the ideal employee's behavior. And I should dig it up. I might send it, but I can tell you, primary style, achievement. Second style, self-actualizing. Next style, dependence, right? And humanistic, encouraging, and affiliative were below the 50th percentile. So, we're not thinking realistically when we're describing what other people need behaviorally and psychologically to do their job well. That's one step too far for a lot of people to think. I hate to say that. It's much better and more accurate if you keep them focused on themselves and what's going to help them get things forward. Then you'll get consistently constructive profiles, if that makes some sense. It's actually very, very interesting that some people describe a totally different ideal for other people than they describe for themselves. That says a lot. It's rare, but it is there. And that's why I tend to prefer to try to get people to answer with reference to what's going to work for me in this business, for me in this team, that sort of thing, or for me, period, in LSI. Well, if there's nothing else I can help for, look at this, we're on time. It's got to be the second one. I've actually hit the time. So good, then thank you for being here. I hope it was helpful. We did record this, so I'm going to cut it and upload this so you'll have the ability to access that. We'll follow up and send you the links when we get to that. But thank you again for taking part. I'll be here for another 5-ish minutes if there's anyone else who wants to hang on and ask any questions. Otherwise, I really hope this was helpful, talking about ideals, how they can be used, the real strengths of them, because they do. To be honest with you, an ideal description of one form or another is the first step I try to get from clients. Before we really start talking about OCI current or anything else, we need to start talking and thinking about where are we going, what do we need to create, and that informs everything around a development initiative. Good. I hope it's been helpful. Thank you so much for your time and participation. I hope to see you next week, Wednesday at 2 o'clock on some other topic. And until then, stay well and stay safe.